In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the events that lead to the outbreak of the First English Civil War. Now, what this is going to be is just a continuation, essentially, of the events that we looked at in the last lesson, which was the lesson covering the long and short parliaments, as well as the attacks on the royal prerogative. So, essentially, this is the outbreak of the formal outbreak of the Civil War. We're going to end this lesson by talking about how it begins and how a formal declaration of war is achieved. And it is essentially the period of history in England from April of 1641 to August of 1642. And we're going to begin by talking about Thomas Wentworth. We've focused on Thomas Wentworth a couple of times, especially when we looked at the relationship between Charles and Ireland. And we're going to talk about the execution of Thomas Wentworth in this lesson, the Earl of Strafford. Now, the reason why Wentworth is so important and signifies such a deepening of tensions between the royalists and the parliamentarians is because Wentworth was represented as the sort of archetype, typical and most stereotypical example of the quote-unquote evil councillors that the parliamentarians tried to fight against. So if you remember in previous lessons, when we talk about all the critiques that Parliament levied against Charles, they often focused on his advisors and his councillors, arguing that it was them that were leading him in a negative direction, and if he was to get rid of them and replace them with better councillors, that this would actually improve the situation. Well, the idea of the evil councillors or the evil advisors were stereotypically represented by people and individuals like Thomas Wentworth. So essentially, the problem that we have in terms of trying to get an execution of Thomas Wentworth, if you are somebody who is a parliamentarian, is that they did not formally meet the definition of treason in their actions. While terrible and while very controversial and tyrannical in a number of actions that they actually performed, Wentworth didn't formally meet that definition. And as a result of this, it was difficult to try and have him be tried and found guilty. And the reason why is because for a treason guilty plea, or at least a guilty verdict of treason, it would require both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, so quite a broad amount of support. Remember as well that in the previous lesson, there isn't this huge majority support for parliamentarians and the anti-royalist establishment. Instead, it was relatively 50-50 at some points, and we'll get to why this is the case in a couple of minutes' time. So what did we do? What happened? Well, John Pym, who wanted to see Wentworth be executed, issued something known as an Act of Attainder. Now, what an Act of Attainder essentially is a medieval instrument. It was used a very long time ago, which allowed Parliament to remove anyone who they saw as a threat to the state. Now, why this was important and why this was seen as something of a workaround for trying to not being able to meet this formal definition of treason was because it could be achieved without the need for a formal trial. Pym would need it to be passed through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords and also receive royal assent from Charles, but it would not require a formal trial. And given the fact that Wentworth didn't meet the definition of treason, a formal trial wasn't necessarily going to yield the guilty verdict, so this was probably the better option for them. Now, what Pym did to try and gain the approval of Parliament for the Act of Attainder was he revealed the existence of a military plot that was being planned by army officers. Now, what this plot essentially involved was an attempt to release Wentworth and to use military force to dissolve Parliament. Now, of course, this would represent a substantial attack on the parliamentary process, a substantial constitutional crisis, even for the time, and so as a result of this, it shocked very much everybody in Parliament to the extent that they were going to be more willing to sign on to and vote for this Act of Attainder. The Act of Attainder, as a result of this, was passed by a vote of 204 to 59. So, even though a significant majority in favour, still 59 people voted against the Act of Attainder to execute Wentworth, even after finding out about these plots that were revealed by Pym. It also received royal assent from Charles, reluctantly received royal assent from Charles, due to the fact that Charles was facing a significant amount of pressure from both Parliament and also the people of London. Remember, we have the root and branch petition. We have the fact that the members of the Society of London were becoming very, very, very uneasy, and there was a growing unrest for Charles's advisors and Charles's reign, mainly and focusing almost entirely on a number of religious issues. The result of this was that Strafford was executed on the 12th of May, and this really does begin to see how we devolve from this execution into a formal civil war. An external factor that was relatively menial in terms of its impact, its physical impact in reality, but was actually incredibly significant in terms of the impact, the perceived impact, was the Irish Rebellion. Now, from October of 1641 and sort of going through the winter of 1641 to 1642, there were rumours in Parliament of an uprising of Irish Catholics. And this rebellion would, like I said, last from the winter between 1641, beginning in October, to in and around the early months of 1642. And essentially, the events of the rebellion itself were very menial in terms of their importance. They're not actually that important. But what is very important for us is the political impact that it had on English politics. Because it was described by historians as a quote-unquote billiard ball effect, in the sense that what it had done was essentially throw fuel onto the fire and radicalise the situation, and sped up the radicalisation of the situation that was going on in England. This was made worse by the fact that it was grossly exaggerated. So these were rumours from a faraway land of a rebellion and an uprising of Irish Catholics. And in reality, it was relatively menial, it was relatively small in terms of the rebellion, but the exaggeration of the rebellion and the effect that this had on the political system in England was much more significant. So, for example, there was reports of over 200,000 Protestants being killed in the rebellion. All of this adding further fuel onto the fire, despite the fact that that is a grossly exaggerated statistic. All of these things culminate in the Grand Remonstrance. So the Grand Remonstrance is something that takes place in November of 1641. And essentially what the Grand Remonstrance is a document. And it's a document that is introduced by Pym, which describes all of the critiques levied against Charles and his actions during his reign. Now, what Pym essentially spent a lot of his time doing was meticulously documenting all of the grievances and problems with Charles's reign, such that when we get to the point where we're going to introduce the Grand Remonstrance, we have quite a detailed understanding of all of the critiques levied against Charles. And in response to these critiques, what the Grand Remonstrance does is introduce a number of proposals, of reforms. And these reforms would represent a significant erosion of the royal prerogative, and it would represent this significant granting of powers to Parliament. All of these things, of course, becoming more and more problematic for Charles. So, for example, it proposed that Parliament should be able to approve the ministers that are picked by Charles. Remember, they still have this big problem with some of Charles's ministers, people like Wentworth, who they've just executed. And so a result of this, and one of the solutions that is presented by Pym is, well, how about we pick your ministers? Or at least you can pick the ministers that you want, but we have to approve of those ministers that are picked. Again, representing a significant erosion of the royal prerogative, given the fact that it means that Charles is no longer able to approve the ministers, to pick them, whoever ministers he wants, because he would need parliamentary approval. What about also the fact that Parliament ought to have greater control over the military? This will become important later, and we'll get to why this is the case in a second. But again, a significant erosion of the powers of the monarch, and essentially transferring those powers from the monarch to Parliament. So, what is important for this at this point when we're in our studies is not necessarily what the Grand Remonstrance actually does, but how it represents the growing divide that begins to exist in Parliament itself. So it should be noted that Parliament isn't acting as a single unified force at this point. There is division and disagreement about the extent to which royalist commitments should be adhered to in Parliament itself, and the extent to which anti-monarchical ideas should be presented as well. So when I say the Parliament voted on these things, or Parliament supported this and that, this is also with the fact that Parliament is also divided at this point. So, for example, the Grand Remonstrance passes. It passes into as part of Parliament, but it is only passed by a very, very slim margin of 159 votes to 148. So you can see here just how controversial it is at this time to make any of these suggestions that even attempt to erode the royal prerogative and attempt to challenge the authority of the monarch. There is still a significant amount of royalists within Parliament who are opposing all of these different pushes. In December of 1641, we see further indication of some of the ways in which there is this growing divide in Parliament. So an anti-monarchist, or at least somebody who is on the side of John Pym, Arthur Haselrig, in December of 1641, introduces a bill into Parliament. And what this bill essentially tries to do is provide an army which would be under the control of Parliament. This is known as the Militia Bill. Now, so essentially what this is doing is trying to implement one of the proposals that is made by the Grand Remonstrance. So the Grand Remonstrance, if we remember, is a relatively controversial document in and of itself. It only passes by a margin of 159 to 148. And now you've got Arthur Haselrig that is trying to pass something that would implement some of the recommendations of the Grand Remonstrance, be able to try and raise an army, provide military force that would be under the express control of Parliament. The Militia Bill was seen as a step too far for a number of these conservative royalists in Parliament, who then swung and returned back to their support for Charles. So at this point, in terms of the waves of support going back and forth within Parliament, at this point in December of 1641, the support in Parliament tended to be towards that of Charles rather than that of the group that were trying to work against Charles. This would change very, very quickly, though, when we get to the incident involving the 5 members, because Charles saw this support that he had, and he thought he would be able to capitalize on this support, and he would be able to try and remove some of the members of Parliament who were his most vocal critics. This would prove to be a significant political miscalculation. On the 4th of January of 1642, what he tried to do is essentially try to utilize the strong position he had to arrest 5 members of Parliament. So the 5 members of Parliament were Denzil Holles, Arthur Haselrig, William Strode, John Pym, and John Hampden. Not John Hampden, just John Hampden. Interestingly, if you are somebody who has watched the movie on Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell movie, it is depicted in that movie relatively well, except in that movie Cromwell is listed as one of the 5 members who is on the arrest warrant. This is not true. This is something that is sort of sensationalized by the movie itself. These are the 5 members who are on the list for Charles's arrest. Now, he went and he decided to go personally to Parliament, to the House of Commons, to make this arrest. He also included an attack against a member of the House of Lords, Lord's opposition leader, Edward Montagu. Now, this would essentially invoke a tradition that is still held to this day when we talk about the opening of Parliament. He stormed into the House of Commons after the doors had been blocked and managed to break his way through. And this is the reason why, even to this day, the monarch is not allowed to step in the House of Commons. And even to this day, when there is a new opening of Parliament, you have the whole fanciful charade where Blackrod comes along and bangs on the door and is forced to open the door. It's all dating back to this particular incident in question. Now, what Charles does is very well documented, everything that happens during this particular event. Charles enters the House of Commons and asks for the whereabouts of the members after asking to use the Speaker's chair. And the Speaker responds with the following quote. He says that, "May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as this house is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here. And I humbly beg your majesty's pardon that I cannot give any other answer to this, to what your majesty is pleased to demand of me." It's a very famous quote, specifically the bit about "I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak," but it is also very significant in terms of the history of the sort of power dynamics in terms of English government, because what this particular quote represents is the first time in history that the Speaker of the House of Commons issues an allegiance to Parliament rather than an allegiance to the monarch. He is essentially saying, I cannot tell you where these people are, where the 5 members are, because I am a servant of the House of Commons. I am not a servant of you. And as a result of this, shows and marks a significant detachment from where the House of Commons as a speaker normally aligned. And as a result, and since then, the House of Commons speaker has always been somebody who is representative of a member who is protective of the House of Commons. The 5 members themselves had been warned about the arrest beforehand, and so they weren't present, and the result of which was that Charles left empty-handed. 6 days later, on the 10th of January, Charles would flee London for fear for himself and his family and seek refuge in Hampton Court. He would not return to to London as a free man ever again. He would return eventually a few years later, after the Civil War is ended and lost. So let's think about the outbreak of the Civil War. Charles has fled London. He's at Hampton Court. So what is actually going to take place? What is actually going to happen? Well, a modified version of the Militia Bill that had been introduced all the way back in December of 1641 by Arthur Heselrigg was introduced to Parliament in March of 1642. This was known as the Militia Ordinance. Now, what essentially it did was act as a call to arms by Parliament. It was not an official piece of legislation for the fact that it did not receive royal assent, because of course Charles was not going to assent to the raising of an army against himself, but it essentially did the thing that it was going to do. It essentially it was a call to arms by Parliament. In response to this, what Charles issued was his own calls to arms, which was known as the Commissions of Array. And in June of 1642, Parliament would issue the final attempt at a peaceful settlement and a peaceful negotiation, this being the 19 Propositions. Now, what the 19 Propositions essentially was similar to the suggestions that were made by Pym and the Grand Remonstrance, but included a number of further demands. Now, there is a little bit of historical debate as to whether or not Parliament was actually trying to seek a peaceful settlement with Charles, or if, knowing that they had a significant advantage in terms of militarily advantage over Charles, were trying to essentially force his hand and just demand what they wanted from him. And the reason for this is because it required a number of things that they should have known probably that Charles was going to reject. For example, it added a requirement that Parliament must approve of royal marriages. Of course, Charles was never going to do so, in terms of accept that as a significant limitation of his royal authority. He refused the 19 Propositions, and in August of 1642, in the city of Nottingham, he declares war, and the Civil War begins. So these are the very complicated series of events that we have from the short Parliament all the way up to August of 1642, the outbreak of the Civil War. The next lesson, well, of course, we're going to start to cover the events of the Civil War, but we're mainly going to focus on some of the historiographical elements of this conflict, focusing on arguments that are made as to why the Royalists were defeated in the First Civil War and why the Parliamentarians won, from a tactical perspective, from a geographical perspective, etc., etc., etc. And we'll focus a little bit on some of the key battles as well.